In October 2004, a war broke out in the small town of Dover, Pennsylvania.
Today, the teachers in a rural Pennsylvania town became the first in the country required to tell students that evolution is not the only theory.
It started when the Dover Area School Board passed a policy requiring that its high school science classes include a controversial subject called intelligent design. Proponents of intelligent design claim that many features of living organisms are too complex to have evolved entirely through the natural process of evolution, as Charles Darwin proposed. Instead, they claim some aspects of those organisms must have been created, fully formed, by a so-called intelligent designer. And, advocates contend, intelligent design is a bold new scientific theory with the power to overthrow the theory of evolution.
It's scientists debating science based on the evidence, not based on any religious text or authority, and it's clearly, properly the subject of a science class.
It's in fact opening the path of inquiry to new ways of thinking about things.
The Dover School Board demanded that science teachers read their students a 1-minute statement claiming that gaps in the theory of evolution exist, and putting forward intelligent design as an alternative. The statement also directed students to an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People that would be made available. But many Dover residents and an overwhelming number of scientists throughout the country were outraged. They say intelligent design is nothing but religion in disguise, the latest front in the war on evolution.
The goal of intelligent design is to try to re-Christianize American society.
Intelligent design is not anywhere a scientific concept. It's not a field of science. It's not being actively researched by anyone.
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
The stage was set for a battle that would pit friend against friend and neighbor against neighbor.
This is like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
Before it was over, this battle would land the school board in federal court. No cameras were allowed in the courtroom, so to bring this historic showdown between evolution and intelligent design to light, Nova has dramatized key scenes from court transcripts. It was a 6-week trial in which modern biology was Exhibit A. And hanging in the balance was not just the Dover biology curriculum. The future of science education in America, the separation of church and state, and the very nature of scientific inquiry were all on trial. In Dover, Pennsylvania, the debate over religion and evolution has long been personal.
We live in a community that has a great many fundamentalist churches.
I've never appreciated the fact that my children are being taught to believe in evolution as opposed to creationism.
In the beginning, God created. To me, that's all I need to know.
Located in the southeastern part of the state, about 20 miles from the capital, it's a quiet, rural place, home to about 20,000 people, more than a dozen churches, and 1 high school. Creationists like Bonsell reject much of modern science in favor of a literal reading of the Bible. They believe the earth is less than 10,000 years old, and that God created everything fully formed, including humans, in just 6 days. Although most mainstream religions made peace with evolution decades ago, many creationists still see evolution as incompatible with their faith. And both creationism and evolution are no strangers to the court. Their legal battles stretch back to the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925.
Now, as I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that man evolved from a lower order of animals.
In that case, a high school science teacher in Tennessee named John Scopes was accused of violating state law by teaching evolution.
I hereby place you under arrest.
Loosely portrayed in the classic film Inherit the Wind, the trial turned into a courtroom showdown between legendary lawyer Clarence Darrow.
The defense wishes to place Dr. Keller on the stand so that he can explain to the gentlemen of the jury the exact meaning of the theory of evolution.
And three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan.
If you had a son, Mr. Sillers, or a daughter, what would you think if that sweet child came home from school and told you that a godless teacher...
Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution and slapped with a mere $100 fine. But the verdict would have a chilling effect on science education throughout the country for the next 3 decades.
After the Scopes trial, textbook publishers decided that evolution was just too controversial a subject, and so they just quietly removed it from the textbooks. And for most of that time, the textbook was the curriculum. And so if it wasn't in the textbook, it didn't get taught.
The chilling effect of the Scopes trial did not thaw until the 1960s. But as publishers slipped evolution back into their textbooks, creationists fought to teach their views in science class as well. Over the next 30 years, the two sides battled it out in court. The fight culminated in 1987, when the Supreme Court decided that teaching creationism in public school science classes violated the separation of church and state, mandated by the Constitution in the Establishment Clause, which prevents the government from promoting or prohibiting any form of religion.
In the eyes of a lot of people, once Charles Darwin had proposed that natural processes could have produced every species on this planet, including us, they felt that took God out of the picture.
And about a century and a half later, many people in Dover, like the United States as a whole, agree.
One more spider, come spider.
To this day, somewhere between a third and half the U.S. population does not accept evolution.
I find it personally offensive because I'm a Christian. I believe the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, and that the book of Genesis tells it like it is as to how we came into being. God didn't create monkey and then take man from a monkey. He created man.
On December 14, 2004, 11 parents of Dover school students, including Tammy Kitzmiller and Brian and Christy Ream, filed a lawsuit in federal court in Pennsylvania, alleging the Dover School Board was violating their constitutional rights by introducing religion into science class. They would be represented by the ACLU, which had joined forces with the organization Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and Philadelphia law firm Pepper Hamilton.
Eric said at the time, "This is the case I've been waiting for my entire career."
The school board would be represented by the Thomas More Law Center, the firm that had told Bill Buckingham about the Pandas book. A court date was set, and as depositions were being taken, the science teachers took a stand of their own against reading the intelligent design statement.
We stepped up and said, we're not going to read it.
We met together and agreed that as a unit, we would stand together.
I mean, I have principles and standards of my own, and there was no way that I was going to go into a science classroom of mine and make a statement about this so-called intelligent design, knowing full well that it was not science.
They notified the board of their refusal in a memo that proclaimed, "Intelligent design is not science. Intelligent design is not biology. Intelligent design is not an accepted scientific theory." On September 26, 2005, almost exactly a year after the school board passed the intelligent design policy, 6 weeks of testimony in the case of Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District got underway in federal court in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Good morning to all of you. Are you prepared to open?
Yes, I am.
You may do so.
My co-counsel and I represent 11 parents who are challenging the Dover Area District School Board's change to its biology curriculum. Dover School Board members announced their interest in the topic of evolution in starkly religious terms. They looked for a book that could provide a religious alternative to evolution. And they found one here, in Of Pandas and People. They did everything you would do if you wanted to incorporate a religious topic in a science class, and cared nothing about its scientific validity.
Patrick Gillen, Your Honor, on behalf of the defendants in this action, the Dover Area School District and its Board of Directors.
The board believed that intelligent design was not creationism. They knew what that was, the book of Genesis.
They believed it was a legitimate educational goal to make the students aware of the existence of another scientific theory.
Defendants' experts will show this court that intelligent design theory is science. It is not religion. This expert testimony will also demonstrate that making students aware of gaps and problems in evolutionary theory is good science education. It's good liberal education.
By the time the trial started, challenges to the teaching of evolution had cropped up in dozens of other states, and intelligent design was attracting some heavy hitters. Rick Santorum, then Pennsylvania senator, had commended the school district for its intelligent design policy, and President Bush had thrown his support behind intelligent design, saying both sides ought to be properly taught so people can understand what the debate is about. Now, the eyes of the nation were on Dover, the latest battleground in the war on evolution.
Now, I don't want to sound melodramatic, but I actually think very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
If a school board could do this, what would prevent them from doing more things like this in other classes, presenting pseudoscience or pseudo-math or pseudo-history in promotion of one particular religious view? It's wrong.
Does science education have to be so narrow, so technical, so deferential to the existing paradigm that we can't even introduce students to what may be the next great theory?
Presiding over the case would be Judge John E. Jones III.
I could never have imagined in August of 2002, when I took my seat, that I would be presiding over a case that would attract literally worldwide attention.
Jones had been recommended for his position on the bench by Senator Santorum and appointed by George W. Bush. Before becoming a judge, Jones was head of Pennsylvania's Liquor Control Board, where he banned the sale of Bad Frog beer because it showed a cartoon frog making an offensive gesture.
Initially, you find out you've got a judge that's been appointed by President Bush, who has come out himself in favor of intelligent design. That makes you a little nervous.
Members of the defense, however, were optimistic about their chances in Jones's courtroom.
What the Dover School Board had done, they weren't requiring that intelligent design be taught, and they weren't removing evolution from the classroom. So it seemed to me this was pretty modest, and so I did think it had a pretty good chance, if it was printed properly, of being accepted.
We didn't have to show that, one theory was better than the other, merely that it was a credible theory, and that the students would gain something by understanding the controversy surrounding the theory of evolution and the origin of species.
The parents who opposed intelligent design, or plaintiffs, had launched the lawsuit, so the burden of proof was on them. And because the parents were asking for the teaching of intelligent design to be halted, an order that only a judge can render, there would be no jury. Instead, the jury box was packed with reporters and writers from around the globe. To win, the plaintiff's lawyers would have to show the judge that the Dover School Board's one-minute statement promoted religion, or that board members had religious motivation. In addition, both sides asked the judge to rule on a fundamental question: is intelligent design science or not?
In order to show that intelligent design is not science, we had to talk about, well, what is science?
For help, the plaintiffs turned to researcher Nick Motzke and his colleagues at an organization called the National Center for Science Education. which tracks challenges to evolution in public schools.
The last time any lawyer took biology was probably in 9th grade, and I spent months and months on email at meetings explaining science, explaining evolution to the lawyers.
To make their case before a judge who had no particular scientific training, the lawyers for the parents assembled a team of expert witnesses. And as their first witness, they called biologist Ken Miller, co-author of the textbook that Bill Buckingham had called Laced with Darwinism.
Dr. Miller, what is evolution?
Most biologists would describe evolution as the process of change over time that characterizes the natural history of life on this planet.
And what was Darwin's contribution to evolution?
Darwin pointed out that there's a struggle for existence, whether we like to admit it or not. He realized that those organisms that had the characteristics that suited them best in that struggle, those were the ones that would hand those characteristics down to the next generation. And that therefore the average characteristics of a population could change in one direction or another, and they could change quite dramatically. And that's the essential idea of natural selection.
Starting with Ken Miller, the plaintiffs walked Judge Jones through the conflict at the heart of this case. Miller testified how Darwin's theory pictures the history of life as a tree, with species gradually evolving into others over millions of years, producing new branches and twigs, a process that gives rise to all the variety of life, from bacteria to Darwin's finches to ourselves. But intelligent design takes a different view, as the movement's own literature shows. Intelligent design teaches a history of life in which organisms appear abruptly, are unrelated, and linked only by their designer.
What's really being advocated is the idea that organisms poofed into existence through the miraculous act of an intelligent designer, i.e. God. That's the view that intelligent design promotes.
So how can scientists be so sure Darwin's tree accurately represents the history of life on Earth? As it turned out, the latest in a large body of evidence to refute intelligent design and support evolution was coming to light just as this case was unfolding.
I remember thinking to myself when all this was going on, where do they get a load of this? Because it's just so beautiful.
Darwin believed that evidence for his idea of common ancestry would be unearthed in the form of transitional fossils. For example, if, over millions of years, fish gave rise to land animals, as evolutionary theory predicts, we should find fossils of extinct creatures that are part fish and part land animal. In 1999, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues set out to find just such a creature.
What evolution enables us to do is to make specific predictions about what we should find in the fossil record. The prediction in this case is clear-cut. That is, if we go to rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, we should find transitions between two great forms of life, between fish and amphibian.
Many scientists think life began in the water, at least 3.5 billion years ago. More recently, about 375 million years ago, the tree of life branched as primitive fish evolved into amphibians, such as today's frogs and salamanders, which live part of their lives on land. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
Over here you have a fish of about 380 million years old. And what you see, just like any good fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You compare that to an amphibian, you find a creature that doesn't have scales, and it's modified the fins to become limbs, arms and legs. And the head's very different. It has a flat head with eyes on top and a neck. What we see when we look at the fossil record, at rocks of just the right age, is a creature like Tiktaalik. Just like a fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You can see the fin webbing here. Yet when you look at the head, you see something very different. You see a very amphibian-like thing with a flat head with eyes on top. It gets even better when we take the fin apart. When we look inside the fin, as in this cast here, well, you'll see it as bones that compare to our shoulder, elbow, even parts of wrist, bone for bone. So you have a fish at just the right time in the history of life that has characteristics of amphibians and primitive fish. It's a mix.
And just as evolutionary theory predicts, Tiktaalik suggests a tree of life, with one species giving rise to another over millions of years. The discovery of Tiktaalik was still being written up at the time of the trial, so it couldn't be used as evidence. But Shubin's colleague, paleontologist Kevin Podian, showed the judge examples of other fossils with transitional features that support Darwin's tree of life.
My testimony in the trial was basically taking a day and showing the judge how we do our work and what the evidence is.
How dinosaurs evolved into birds, as seen in creatures like Archaeopteryx, which has a long tail and teeth like a dinosaur, but feathers just like a modern bird. How ancestors of modern reptiles evolved into creatures now extinct that share a common ancestor with mammals. And how surprisingly whales evolved from large land animals that returned to the water.
And where the pandas book says we can't go from A to B, there are no fossils and we don't know how to study them. Actually, we've gone from A to B and to C, D, E, F, and G. We have the fossils, we have the transitional features, we have the ways of analyzing them with many different lines of evidence, and we're looking for the picture that accounts for the most lines of objective evidence.
With each fossil, Podian refuted Panda's claim that different life forms appear suddenly by showing how fossils of extinct organisms bridge the gaps between species, resulting in a picture of gradual evolution, just as Darwin proposed.
The reporters in the courtroom were just amazed that we knew all this stuff, and how come they hadn't learned about this stuff before? And the reason is, it's not in textbooks because the creationists fight so hard to keep it out. That's been a big influence.
The court took a break, and I remember the judge saying something like, biology class adjourned, for lunch, and he was, smiling, and it was clear that we had the judge interested in science.
I'm a professor of integrative biology.
Lawyers for the parents may have impressed the judge and reporters, but many in Dover wondered, why is evolution taught as fact if it's just a theory?
Maybe Darwinism is the prevalent theory out there today, but it is a theory. It isn't a law of science. It isn't, a fact. It is a theory.
We just wanted alternative views talked about too. We weren't saying don't talk about Darwin. Talk about Darwin. It's a theory. But that's what it is. It's not Darwin's law. It's not Darwin's fact. It's Darwin's theory.
To say it's just a theory is really a bit insulting to science, because it holds, in science, the theory holds more weight than just a fact does.
And here I think the term theory needs to be looked at in the way that scientists consider it. A theory is not something we think of in the middle of the night after too much coffee and not enough sleep. That's an idea. A theory in science means a large body of information that's withstood a lot of testing. It probably consists of a number of different hypotheses and many different lines of evidence. Gravitation is a theory that's unlikely to be falsified, even if we saw something fall up. It might make us wonder, but we try to figure out what was happening rather than immediately just dismiss gravitation.
Facts are just the minutiae of science. By themselves, they can be right or wrong. But a theory is something that's been tested and tested over and over again, built on, revised. It continues to be reworked and revised.
Dr. Miller, would you agree that Darwin's theory of evolution is not an absolute truth?
Well, I certainly would, for the very simple reason that no theory in science, no theory is ever regarded as absolute truth. We don't regard atomic theory as truth. We don't regard the germ theory of disease as truth. We don't regard the theory of friction as truth. We regard all of these theories as well-supported, testable explanations that provide natural explanations for natural phenomena.
Should we regard Darwin's theory of evolution as tentative?
We should regard all scientific explanations as being tentative, and that includes the theory of evolution.
Science is about discovering the unknown, what we don't know. I don't focus on what we know as a scientist. I want to find new things that tell me about what I don't know.
As the plaintiffs testified, that quest to investigate the unknown has led to the discovery of some of the strongest evidence for evolution. Darwin was convinced that species evolve over time through natural selection acting on inherited traits. But he had no idea how those traits arose, or how they were passed from generation to generation. When 20th century scientists discovered the role DNA plays in heredity, they founded a new science called genetics that put Darwin's theory to the test. Virtually every cell in every living thing contains chromosomes, which are made of densely packed strands of DNA that function as a blueprint of the individual organism's characteristics. During reproduction, chromosomes from each parent replicate and shuffle their parts to produce new chromosomes. Then each parent passes chromosomes to offspring. But the process is imperfect. Along the way, DNA is subject to random mutations or mistakes, giving each offspring its own unique blueprint. Sometimes this produces characteristics in offspring that are benign. Other times it produces harmful characteristics, like a misshapen wing. But occasionally, the process gives rise to a beneficial trait. For example, a butterfly whose coloration mimics another species that tastes bad to birds. About 100 years after Darwin proposed that natural selection acts on new traits appearing in a population, genetics revealed the biological mechanism that gives rise to those traits in the first place.
And therefore you could say that when modern genetics came into being, everything in Darwin's theory was at risk, could have been overturned if it turned out that genetics contradicted the essential elements of evolutionary theory. But it didn't contradict them. It confirmed them in great detail.
And as Miller would testify, a genetics paper published less than a year before the trial had confirmed what has long been the most inflammatory part of Darwin's theory, the common ancestry of humans and apes. That paper explored a curious discrepancy in our chromosomes. The cells of all great apes, like chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, contain 24 pairs of chromosomes. If humans share a common ancestor with apes, you'd expect us to have the same number. But surprisingly, human cells contain only 23 pairs.
The question is, if evolution is right about this common ancestry idea, where'd the chromosome go? Well, evolution makes a testable prediction. And that is that somewhere in the human genome, we ought to be able to find a piece of Scotch tape holding two chromosomes together, so that our 24 pairs, two of them were pasted together to form just 23. And if we can't find that, then the hypothesis of common ancestry is wrong and evolution is mistaken. Next slide.
To solve this riddle for the court, Miller would show how scientists discovered traces of our evolutionary past buried in the very structure of a chromosome carried by all humans. Typically, on the ends of every chromosome, you should find special genetic markers, or sequences of DNA, called telomeres. And in their middles, you should find different genetic markers called centromeres. But if a mutation occurred in the past, causing two pairs of chromosomes to fuse, we should find evidence in those genetic markers, telomeres not only at the ends of the new chromosome, but also at their middles, and not one, but two centromeres. Finding a structure like this in our chromosomes would explain why humans have one pair fewer than the great apes.
And if we don't find that, then evolution is in trouble. Next slide. Lo and behold, the answer is in chromosome number 2. All of the marks of the fusion of those chromosomes predicted by common descent and evolution, all those marks are present on human chromosome number 2. So the case is closed in a most beautiful way. And that is, the prediction of evolution of common ancestry is fulfilled by that lead pipe evidence that you see here, in terms of tying everything together. That our chromosome, formed by the fusion from our common ancestor, is chromosome number 2. Evolution has made a testable prediction, and it has passed.
So, modern genetics and molecular biology actually support evolutionary theory?
They support it in great detail. And the closer we can get to looking at the details of the human genome, the more powerful that evidence has become.
Darwin didn't even know about molecular biology and DNA, yet that's where some of the most profound evidence is being uncovered today. Think about that. That somebody in the 1800s made predictions that are being confirmed in molecular biology labs today. That's a very profound statement of a very successful theory.
Not a single observation, not a single experimental result has ever emerged in 150 years that contradicts the general outlines of the theory of evolution. Any theory that can stand up to 150 years of contentious testing is a pretty darn good theory, and that's what evolution is.
And the deep understanding of evolution, as proposed by Darwin, has with genetics unlocked many of the secrets of life.
It's an explanatory framework within which all the rest of biology fits. Right? It's something that we use in practical biological applications. Medicine, agriculture, industry. When you're getting a flu vaccine, that really depended upon evolutionary knowledge. In many, many specific ways, evolution makes a practical difference. It's not just something that happened in the past, evolution's happening now.
So if evolution has stood up to all this scrutiny, what about intelligent design? Does it play by the same rules?
If you invoke a non-natural cause, a spirit force or something like that in your research, I have no way to test it.
So, supernatural causation is not considered part of science?
Yeah. I hesitate to beg the patience of the court with this, but being a Boston Red Sox fan, I can't resist it. One might say, for example, that the reason the Boston Red Sox were able to come back from 3 games down against the New York Yankees was because God was tired of George Steinbrenner and wanted the Red Sox to win. In my part of the country, you'd be surprised how many people think that's a perfectly reasonable explanation for what happened last year. And you know what? It could be true. But it certainly wouldn't be science. It's not scientific. And it's certainly not something we can test.
The fundamental problem with intelligent design is that you can't use it to explain the natural world. It's essentially a negative argument. It says evolution doesn't work, therefore the designer did it. Evolution doesn't work, therefore we win by default. But when you ask them, what does intelligent design tell you about nature? Does it tell you what the designer did? Does it tell you what the designer used to design something with? Does it tell you what purpose the designer had for designing something? Does it tell you when the designer did it? Why the designer did it? It doesn't tell you anything like that. Basically, it's a negative argument, and you can't build a science on a negative argument.
After 3 weeks of testimony on the nature of science, the evidence for evolution, and the failings of intelligent design, the plaintiffs had presented their case.
To watch the whole thing, you got an education in what evolution was, where evolution stands as a theory now in the 21st century. If you concentrated, you would get sucked into this thing, and the day would go by, and you'd come out and you'd think, that was amazing what I heard here. And these eloquent people, you know, with these incredible educations, and it was fantastic.
The plaintiff's attorneys had put on an amazing case. But there was this idea, especially among those who weren't sitting in the trial every day, that when the defense started, you know, then we'll see some pretty interesting stuff too on the other side.
The question now was, could the defense prove that intelligent design is a scientific theory? What evidence could they muster to support this claim? To make the case for intelligent design, the defense had lined up 8 expert witnesses, including several members of the Discovery Institute, the Seattle organization that promotes intelligent design. But of those 8 witnesses, 5 never testified.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
We still haven't heard a complete explanation of why this happened, but there was some dispute going on between the Discovery Institute and the Thomas More Law Center over how the case would be run.
Nova made repeated requests to interview members of the Discovery Institute to talk about this and other issues, but the Institute set conditions that were inconsistent with normal journalistic practice. For the defense to win, however, did not require a large number of witnesses.
Our aim was not really to disprove Darwin's theory of evolution. Our aim was to merely show that there are credible scientists who believe that the empirical data was supportive of intelligent design. That's all we had to show.
It was our thinking, if they could prove that there was a scientific basis for intelligent design, that it would be possible that the court could conclude that there was a valid secular purpose for teaching intelligent design.
I think everybody was waiting to see whether or not the intelligent design folks had a case. But by the time we finished presenting our case, I think it was pretty clear that everything rested on Michael Behe's testimony.
A scientist and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, Michael Behe is the author of the popular intelligent design book Darwin's Black Box, and dozens of papers unrelated to intelligent design published in peer-reviewed science journals. Behe refused multiple invitations from Nova to be interviewed for this program, though he went on record in the trial.
Dr. Behe, what is your profession?
I am a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
And you're a biochemist?
That's correct, yes.
How long have you taught at the college level?
For 23 years.
Sir, what is intelligent design?
Intelligent design is a scientific theory that proposes that some aspects of life are best explained as the result of design, and that the strong appearance of design in life is real and not just apparent.
Is intelligent design based on any religious beliefs or convictions?
No, it isn't.
What is it based on?
It is based entirely on observable, empirical, physical evidence from nature, plus logical inferences.
Now, when you use the term design, what do you mean?
Well, I discuss this in my book, Darwin's Black Box, and a short description of design is shown in this quotation from Chapter 9. Quote, "What is design? Design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. When we perceive that parts have been arranged to fulfill a purpose, that's when we infer design." End quote.
Part of the defense strategy would be to show the judge examples of biological systems they claimed were too complex to have evolved by natural selection, and therefore must have been the product of a designer.
Can you give us a biochemical example of design, Dr. Behe?
Yes, that's on the next slide. I think the best, well, the most visually striking example of design is something called the bacterial flagellum. Now, this is a figure of a bacterial flagellum taken from a textbook, which is widely used in colleges and universities around the country. The bacterial flagellum is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. And in order to accomplish that function, it has a number of parts which are ordered to that effect. Now, this part here, which is labeled the filament, is actually the propeller of the bacterial flagellum. The motor is actually a rotary motor. And most people who see this and have the function explained to them quickly realize that these parts are ordered for a purpose and therefore bespeak design.
Under the microscope, bacteria powered by flagella seem almost acrobatic. They tumble, corkscrew, and pirouette, thanks to that whip-like filament. Driving this propeller is a tiny motor, part of a complex structure made of about 40 different kinds of proteins.
The bacterial flagellum looks like a sort of Jules Verne notion of what the future looks like. It has a strange sort of mechanical quality to it, these sort of cogs and waving tails and stuff.
And according to Behe, if any one of these parts is missing from the system, the motor can't function. Behe calls systems like this irreducibly complex, a term he coined. And he argues such systems could not have evolved naturally.
The idea is that there are certain aspects of life, perhaps organisms or organs or even cells, that in a sense could only have come about as a whole. In other words, it was very unlikely they could have come about through just a kind of contingent combination of parts over even millions or billions of years, but rather in a sense had to be created whole cloth, all together at once, because everything fits together so well that to remove one part the thing wouldn't function.
Have other scientists acknowledged these design features of the flagellum?
Yes, they have. If you could advance the next slide. In 1998, a man named David de Rosier wrote an article in the journal Cell, which is a very prestigious scientific journal, entitled The Turn of the Screw, the Bacterial Flagellar Motor. Now, David de Rosier is a professor of biology at Brandeis University in Massachusetts and has worked on the bacterial flagellar motor for most of his career. Now, in that article, he makes a statement, quote, "More so than other motors, the flagellum resembles a machine designed by a human," close quote. So David de Rosier also recognizes that the structure of the flagellum appears designed.
What I wrote was, this is a machine that looks like it was designed by a human, but that doesn't mean it was designed. That is the product of intelligent design. Indeed, this more has all the earmarks of something that arose by evolution.
Using an electron microscope, de Rosier produces ghostly pictures like this one, revealing the inner workings of what's been called the world's most efficient motor.
This is the drive shaft. This transmits this torque generated by the motor. That would then turn the propeller, which would push the bacterial cell through the fluid.
Michael Behe has argued that the flagellum could not have evolved, since its parts have no function for natural selection to act on until they are fully assembled. But evidence that refutes Behe's claim of irreducible complexity comes from a tiny syringe that injects poison, found in some of the nastiest of all bacteria.
This is a structure found, for example, in Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes the bubonic plague. And look at the similarities. Now, this structure doesn't rotate, but it still has to extend this structure, which is equivalent to the rod, the drive shaft here. It has to extend that because it needs this little channel. It's like sort of like a syringe. So the virulence factors that are made inside the cell, which is down here, can be exported, pushed up into this hole, and exported out through this long kind of needle, perhaps into a cell in your body or mine, and thereby create misery.
And it turns out the two structures look similar for a reason. The syringe on the right is made of a subset of the very same protein types found in the base of the flagellum on the left. Though the syringe is missing proteins found in the motor and therefore cannot produce rotary motion, it functions perfectly as an apparatus for transmitting disease.
So if we think about what it means to be irreducibly complex, the argument is that if you take away even one of these proteins, that the structure cannot function. And yet here is a structure that functions, that is missing several of the proteins, and yet here it is, a working, viable organelle of the bacterium. So indeed, this structure is not, in that sense, irreducibly complex.
To emphasize de Rosier's point, Miller arrived at court making an unusual fashion statement.
As an example of what irreducible complexity means, advocates of intelligent design like to point to a very common machine, the mousetrap. And the mousetrap is composed of 5 parts. It has a base plate, the catch, a spring, a little hammer that actually does the dirty work, and a bait holder. The mousetrap will not work if any one of these 5 parts are taken away. That's absolutely true. But remember the key notion of irreducible complexity, and that is that this whole machine is completely useless until all the parts are in place. Well, that turns out not to be true. And I'll give you an example. What I have right here is a mousetrap from which I've removed 2 of the 5 parts. I still have the base plate, the spring, and the hammer. Now, you can't catch any mice with this, so it's not a very good mousetrap. But it turns out that despite the missing parts, it makes a perfectly good, if somewhat inelegant, tie clip. And when we look at the favorite examples for irreducible complexity, and the bacterial flagellum is a perfect example, we find the molecular equivalent of my tie clip, which is we see parts of the machine missing 2, 3, 4, maybe even 20 parts, but still fulfilling a perfectly good purpose that could be favored by evolution. And that's why the irreducible complexity argument falls apart.
But Behe testified it's not just microscopic organisms that are irreducibly complex. Evolution, he says, fails to account for the network of organs and cells that defend us from disease.
Has the theory of evolution, in particular natural selection, explained the existence of the defensive apparatus such as the immune system?
No.
Do you consider it a problem?
I certainly consider it to be a problem. But other scientists who think that Darwinian evolution simply is true don't consider much of anything to be a problem for their theory.
If you could highlight the second full paragraph of Darwin's black box, page 138. What you say is, we can look high or we can look low, in books or in journals, but the result is the same. The scientific literature has no answers on the question of the origin of the immune system.
And in the context, that means that the scientific literature has no detailed, testable answers to the question of how the immune system could have arisen by random mutation and natural selection.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may. What I did was to pile on the witness stand articles all having very sophisticated explanations for how the immune system evolved, and it basically challenged him to respond given the claims he'd made.
Now, Dr. Behe, these articles rebut your assertion that the scientific literature has no answers on the origin of the vertebrate immune system.
No, they certainly do not. My argument is that these articles have no detailed, rigorous explanations for how complex biochemical systems could arise by a random mutation and natural selection, and these articles do not address that.
And then he starts to say, well, have you read this book, Dr. Behe? And he starts to pile these up on Behe's witness stand. Eventually, Behe was almost dwarfed by the stack of scientific literature on the evolutionary origin of the immune system.
All these hard-working scientists published article after article over years and years, chapters and books, full books, addressing the question of how the vertebrate immune system evolved. But none of them are satisfactory to you.
That's a lawyer's trick. Purely a lawyer's trick. Now, you know, was Michael Behe going to read every one of those books before he responded? You know, it was totally theatrics.
Mr. Rothschild, would you like your books back? They're heavy.
The defense case included 3 expert witnesses. And on the last day of testimony, the final defense witness told the court about a creature that by now was familiar to everyone.
I'm Dr. Scott A. Minnick. I'm an associate professor at the University of Idaho in microbiology.
Dr. Minnick, can you give us an example of design at the molecular level?
This is a bacterial flagellum. This is a system I work with.
We've seen that.
I know.
You're going to see a little more of it, Your Honor.
I kind of feel like Zsa Zsa's 5th husband here, you know. As the old adage goes, I know what to do, I just can't make it exciting. But I'll try.
Now, you specialized your focus and research on the flagellum, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And you've done experiments on the flagellum.
I have.
And you've written peer-reviewed articles on it.
Yes.
Now, Dr. Minnick, a complaint that's often brought up, and plaintiffs' experts have brought it up in this case, is that intelligent design is not testable. It's not falsifiable. Would you agree with that claim?
No, I don't. I have a quote here from Mike Behe. In fact, intelligent design is open to direct experimental rebuttal. To falsify such a claim, a scientist could go into the laboratory, place a bacterial species lacking a flagellum under some selective pressure, for motility, say, grow it for 10,000 generations and see if a flagellum or any equally complex system was produced. If that happened, my claims would be neatly disproven.
Is that an experiment that you would do?
You know, I think about it. I'd be intrigued to do it. I wouldn't expect it to work, but that's my bias.
Now, you claim intelligent design can be tested, correct?
Correct.
Intelligent design, according to you, is not tested at all, because neither you nor Dr. Behe have run the test that you yourself advocate for testing intelligent design, right?
Well, turn it around in terms of these major attributes of evolution. Have they been tested? You see what I'm saying, Steve? It's a problem for both sides.
And that became probably our best single piece of evidence at trial.
Barbara Forrest's testimony would make a strong case that the Dover School Board was thrusting religion into the classroom. Not only traced the creationist lineage of pandas, citing a Christian magazine's interview, Forrest let one of the intelligent design movement's own leaders, Paul Nelson, speak for himself.
The question he was asked was, is intelligent design just a critique of evolutionary theory, or does it offer something more? Does it offer something that humankind needs to know? And this is his answer, quote, easily the biggest challenge facing the ID community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have such a theory right now, and that's a real problem. Without a theory, it's very hard to know where to direct your research focus. Right now, we've got a bag of powerful intuitions and a handful of notions, such as irreducible complexity, but as yet, no general theory of biological design, end quote.
The evidence she brought into that courtroom really exposed the hypocrisy of the intelligent design movement in a way that's irrefutable. She used their own language, things that they had written and said, to show that they themselves knew that this isn't science.
And on the stand, Michael Behe was asked how he would define science.
Dr. Behe, using your definition, intelligent design is a scientific theory, correct?
Yes.
Under the same definition, astrology is a scientific theory, using your definition, correct?
Using my definition, a scientific theory is a proposed explanation which focuses or points to observable physical data and logical inferences. There are many things throughout the history of science which we now think to be incorrect, which would fit that definition. Yes, astrology is in fact one. So is the ether theory of the propagation of light, and many other theories as well.
The ether theory of light has been discarded.
That is correct.
But you're clear. Under your definition, the definition that sweeps in intelligent design, astrology is also a scientific theory.
Yes, that's correct.
When you loosen the rules around what is science and permit the supernatural, permit deities, you are really destroying what makes science so vitally important to the progress that our civilization has witnessed over the last 400 or 500 years. You're going back before the scientific revolution, and that's a pretty scary thing.
With the scientific revolution, the work of Galileo, Newton, and others banished supernatural explanations from science. But some think the supernatural still has its place.
At the very beginning of genetics, the idea of there being a hereditary factor that somehow was responsible for the traits that we have, but one couldn't quite identify what the factor was. That was also initially regarded as supernatural as well. So it's not that supernaturalism hasn't been part of science. In fact, it has been, and it's often led to very fruitful results. And it seems that the evolutionists want to, in a way, ignore or marginalize that very important part of the history.
But Barbara Forrest testified that the intelligent design movement's goals are not entirely scientific, and are spelled out in a secret Discovery Institute document that had surfaced on the Internet.
Their goals are listed quite clearly in the Wedge document. It's their strategy document that they drew up about 9 years ago in 1998. Their goal is to completely overthrow all of the effects of evolution on society, which they think are uniformly negative. This document states that they want to completely change American culture back to what they believe is its properly religious foundation. They want every area of life to be governed by their particular religious preferences, and they're very clear about that in this document.
After 6 weeks, the trial concluded with closing arguments that were as divided as the town of Dover itself had become.
What am I supposed to tolerate? A small encroachment on my First Amendment rights? Well, I'm not going to. I think this is clear what these people have done, and it outrages me. That's a statement of one citizen of Dover, Fred Callahan, standing up to the wedge that has been driven into his community and his daughter's high school by the Dover School Board's anti-evolution, pro-intelligent design policy. This trial has established that intelligent design is unconstitutional because it is an inherently religious proposition, a modern form of creationism. It is not just a product of religious people. It does not just have religious implications. It is, in its essence, religious. The shell game has to stop.
In sum, Your Honor, I respectfully submit that the evidence of record shows that the plaintiffs have failed to prove that the primary purpose or primary effect of the reading of a 4-paragraph statement on intelligent design, explaining that it's an explanation for the origins of life different from Darwin's theory, letting the students know there are books in the library on this subject, does not, by any reasonable measure, threaten the harm which the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits. But instead, the evidence shows that the defendant's policy has the primary purpose and primary effect of advancing science education by making the students aware of a new scientific theory, one which may well open a fascinating prospect to a new scientific paradigm.
Judge Jones said he would return a verdict promptly. The 139-page opinion ruled that intelligent design is not science. Finding it had been introduced for religious reasons, Judge Jones decided it was unconstitutional to teach intelligent design in Dover science classes.
Both defendants and many of the leading proponents of intelligent design make a bedrock assumption which is utterly false. Their presupposition is that evolutionary theory is antithetical to a belief in the existence of a supreme being and to religion in general. To be sure, Darwin's theory of evolution is imperfect. However, the fact that a scientific theory cannot yet render an explanation on every point should not be used as a pretext to thrust an untestable alternative hypothesis grounded in religion into the science classroom or to misrepresent well-established scientific propositions. The citizens of the Dover area were poorly served by the members of the board who voted for the intelligent design policy.
Citing what he called the breathtaking inanity of the school board's decision, he found that several members had lied to cover their tracks and disguise the real purpose behind the intelligent design policy.
The crushing weight of the evidence indicates that the board set out to get creationism into science classrooms, and intelligent design was simply the vehicle that they utilized to do that.
And the overwhelming evidence at trial, he said, established that intelligent design is a religious view, a mere relabeling of creationism, and not a scientific theory.
In an era where we're trying to cure cancer, where we're trying to prevent pandemics, where we're trying to keep science and math education on the cutting edge in the United States, to introduce and teach bad science to 9th grade students makes very little sense to me. You know, garbage in, garbage out, and it doesn't benefit any of us who benefit daily from scientific discoveries.
The school district was permanently forbidden to teach intelligent design in its science curriculum. The administration was ordered to pay the plaintiffs' legal fees, totaling more than $1 million. And the election of a new school board opposed to intelligent design meant no appeal of the ruling would be mounted. The verdict turned out to be more controversial than Judge Jones had imagined. Following the trial, he received death threats. Jones and his family had to be placed under round-the-clock protection.
I could never have imagined that I would receive threats to my person in an Establishment Clause case, but that's what happened in the Dover case. I think history tells us that there is an enduring disagreement and dispute in the United States as it relates to evolution. By no means did my decision put a capstone on that, and that will proceed for generations, I suspect.